From the calming and lighthearted Animal Crossing to the decidedly more mature Bayonetta, the Super Smash Bros. Universe holds one of the largest and most diverse casts of characters in all of media. But now that everyone is finally here, we have to ask, how do all of these varied characters stack up with one another in terms of morality? Which of these hopeful heroes has the highest honors, and which villain is the most malicious monster in the multiverse? I'm Kyle with 1UP Binge, and this is the complete Super Smash Bros. Lineup, from good to evil. But before we begin, let's set up some ground rules. First of all, we'll only be covering official playable characters in this video, i.e. ones that have names and titles in the Smash Bros. Universe. This means assist trophies, spirits, and characters that only appear as Mii Fighter costumes will not count. However, characters who appear as alternate costumes for another fighter have their own titles in-game, and therefore, will be counted in this list. This means that we have well over 100 characters to cover on this list, for those of you out there counting, so we're gonna have to be pretty quick about this. Additionally, we'll only be looking at these characters in the context of their respective home universes, meaning that the actions and events in the Smash Bros. Universe itself won't be looked at except where strictly necessary. With all that said, let's get into our ranking. Make sure to get comfortable because this is going to be a long ride. As usual, we'll be starting with the most noble and pure characters and working our way down to the most evil. These characters are the good. For our gold medal of good, we have the hero king of Atlia, Marth. As a character, Marth is a bit of a Marty Sue, or Marthy Sue, in that he's basically a perfect character. He's a strong and kind leader, both on and off the battlefield, doing everything in his power to protect his friends and subordinates even when the odds are stacked against them. Despite this, he never lets his overprotectiveness get in the way of rational thinking, as he never discourages anyone offering to fight alongside him, whether it's a random woodcutter he met on the road or his own fiancée. He's also kind and merciful to those who oppose him, more than willing to spare his foes and find a peaceful solution where possible. We're hard-pressed to find any fault whatsoever with him, so it was an easy choice to give him the gold medal of good. The silver medal of good goes to the newest member of the cast, Sora. Take a wild guess as to why Sora ranks as high as he does. If you said anything other than Sora is a Disney protagonist, then we have some serious concerns about your reasoning ability. He's kind, brave, loyal, and unreasonably forgiving, even towards his mortal enemies. He cares deeply for his friends and is willing to do anything to protect them. There are a few flaws with him, however. He's rash and intolerant towards cowardice and selfishness, though these are incredibly minor by comparison. That said, minor that they may be, they do exist, which places him just beneath Marth by default. Still, there is no denying that Sora is very heroic and definitely deserves the silver medal of good. Our bronze medal of good goes to the literal angel, Pit. As the captain of Palutena's guard, Pit is often on the front lines battling the underworld army, whether it's trying to rescue Palutena herself or merely following her orders to protect humanity. He takes great pride in his servitude and genuinely seems to care for the humans he's tasked to protect. The only thing that keeps Pit from scoring any higher is the fact that he's a tad young and has a few of the vices that come with the territory, such as laziness and general angst. However, these things are typically very minor and don't detract anything from his morality in the long run. Really, it's a testament to Pit's morality that the embodiment of all darkness in his heart ends up being just as heroic as he is. But we'll come back to that later. It's a tough call for this next one, but we're giving this spot to the Princess of Hyrule, Zelda. And before anyone asks, no, we're not going to be discussing Sheik here, because spoiler alert for a 23-year-old game, Sheik and Zelda are the same person. Regardless, even if we ignore Sheik entirely, Zelda is still a tricky character to place. The main reason being that there have been several Zeldas throughout the Hyrule timeline, each with their own actions, personalities, and flaws. And the Zelda shown in Smash is more of an amalgamation of her various incarnations, rather than any one particular Zelda. As a result, we can only judge this Zelda by the traits and actions that are consistent across all other incarnations. And thankfully, it all comes out pretty good. As the destined princess chosen by the goddess of wisdom, Zelda is generally a kind, level-headed intellectual who does whatever she can for the good of Hyrule, whether indirectly or directly in some cases. Rarely is she shown as solely a damsel in distress, often taking an active role in whatever climactic battle makes up the finale. Unlike a few other spots on this list, a few of her incarnations have some major flaws that would have individually cost them a few spots on this list, but because they're never consistent across all Zeldas, they don't end up hurting her overall average. Up next, we have the goddess of light herself, Palutena. Despite never having an active role in any of the Kid Icarus games, Palutena makes it clear that she earns her title as the Goddess of Light. She takes pride in her role as the protector of humanity, and genuinely cares about those who look to her for guidance. Despite the fact that almost all of the gods, Palutena included, generally view humans as inferior creatures, she's also the one who put a stop to Medusa's mass genocide of the human race, and constantly wages war against the various forces that would cause harm to humans. She also cares about her subordinates as well, taking care of her troops' safety and even having a bit of a mother-son relationship with Pit. There is that arc where Palutena does turn to hunting humans and generally destroying Skyworld in the process, but as she was under the control of the Chaos Kin at the time, we can't really count that against her here. The only thing we can really fault her for is a slight superiority complex, which leads her to act a bit condescending to those beneath her, though it's still not nearly as bad as that of other gods. Ultimately, when it comes to the old gods, you could do a lot worse than Palutena. Just don't call her old unless you want her to smite you. Our next spot goes to Coron. As a direct descendant of Marth, it should come as no surprise how Coron ranks as high as he does. He is a strong warrior, almost too much so, as he continuously ends up causing some level of property damage during his routine training. He's a kind and caring ruler, who does whatever he can to keep both his citizens and the shepherds who fight for him safe. However, that caring nature ends up being a double-edged sword for Coron, as his biggest flaw is that he often lets his emotions get the better of him, and lets his protectiveness take precedence over rational decisions, such as when he was willing to surrender the Fire Emblem in exchange for the return of his elder sister. Still, if the worst you can say about someone is that they care too much, you know you have a good character on your hands. Next, we have the original vampire hunter, Simon Belmont. As the fifth Belmont to wield the legendary vampire killer, Simon takes his family's fate upon his shoulders to do battle against the vicious Dracula and the many creatures of the night that lurk in his castle. While that is noble and cool, that's basically the beginning and end of his character. Several retellings of the original story play around with his personality and motivations. However, the key word there is retellings. It's all alternate versions of the same story. There is that period in Castlevania Judgment where he starts to question his abilities due to his reliance on the vampire killer, as well as him trying to resurrect Dracula in Castlevania 2 in order to break the curse he received during the first game. But neither of these really affect his character all too much, so there's still not much to work with. Conversely, we have nothing to really fault him for either, so he still enjoys a high spot on the list. Moving on, we have a rather surprising entry, Lucas. Originally a shy and timid boy from Tazmily Village, Lucas ends up going through quite a lot during the course of his game. After losing almost his entire family after being attacked in a burning forest, he falls into a deep depression, shutting himself up in his home for over 3 years. However, rather than continue to wallow in his guilt and fear, Lucas ends up stepping up in order to save his village from the pig masks that have taken over and to try to find his missing brother. During his journey, he quickly grows out of his shell and matures into a kind and heroic young man, more than willing to come to the rescue of anyone in danger. He does have a bit of a rebellious streak that makes him come across as a bit snarky, but come on, what 14-year-old boy doesn't have some level of angst in them? Coming in at just 3 slots behind her father, we have Lucina. Coming from a post-apocalyptic future, she initially comes across as aloof and distant, but has a much more soft and caring nature underneath. In her own time, she fought constantly trying to protect what little remains of humanity are left, even going as far as to leap into a one-way time vortex in an attempt to prevent the revival of the fell dragon, Grima, whose return was the cause of her time's demise. She cares deeply for her father, Crom, relishing in the opportunity to have a relationship with him that she never had the chance to have in her own timeline. That said, like father, like daughter, this obsession ends up counting both for and against her in this ranking, as she prioritizes her father's safety over all else, including the lives of others around them. since she believes that Chrom is the key to her world's survival. Granted, this ended up being more or less true, but it still goes too far when she was willing to kill Robin when she believed them to be a threat to Chrom's safety. However, she quickly realizes her mistakes and does whatever she can to protect them both in the climax. And really, what more could you ask for? We may as well lump all the Links into one entry, represented in Smash as Link, Young Link, and Toon Link. As evidenced by there being multiple characters with the same name, there has been several separate Links in the Zelda timeline, much like the titular princess. Young Link is known as the hero of time, Toon Link is the hero of winds, and the so-called regular Link is more of an amalgamation of several Links, but currently pulling mainly from his Breath of the Wild incarnation. Unlike Zelda, however, there is very little differentiation from one Link to another, meaning we can not only rank them together, but we have more material to look at in terms of judging his ranking. Unfortunately for the heroic Hylian, this does them no favors as the Links tend to suffer from what we like to call silent protagonist syndrome. While silent protagonists can work in video games as a player insert character, particularly in RPGs, because they're a player insert, much of their personality is up to the player's interpretation, meaning we can neither add nor take away many points for it. Their actions are heroic enough to warrant a high rank on the list, but without an established personality to back those actions up, we just can't rank any of our Links any higher. Next, we finally come to Mr. Nintendo himself, Mario. We're sure we don't have to go too deep into describing Mario. In a similar vein to Link, Mario is a kind plumber who is always the first to rush into danger to rescue the Mushroom Kingdom, namely Peach, from danger. He also has to be convinced to step up from time to time, though not nearly as often as some of the others on our list. Sadly, Mario tends to suffer from a lot of the same issues that kept the Links from ranking any higher. While not quite a player insert character, Mario is still a silent protagonist with limited expression, and therefore, we can't get as good of a reading on his personality. Still, it's very clear that he is a big hero, so he earns himself a more than respectable ranking on our list. Moving on to the leader of Star Fox, Fox McCloud. Fox has often been described as a furry Luke Skywalker, and for good reason, since the resemblance is quite uncanny. He is an outspoken and righteous hero who puts the well-being of innocents above all else. He's willing to do whatever it takes to complete his mission, even if he's prone to complaining. That being said, there are two noticeable marks on his record which kept him from ranking any higher. The first is a sizable inferiority complex, where he constantly compares himself to his father, James, leading him to question himself from time to time. And the other is that, at the end of the day, Star Fox is a mercenary group, meaning their overall morality is ultimately up to their employer. While it's not likely that Fox would accept a job for less than noble reasons, there's not really anything keeping him from changing his mind when their gas money runs low. Still, Fox has earned his title as the defender of the Lilat system, and another more than respectable placement in our ranking. Moving on to Capcom's answer to Astro Boy, we have Mega Man. Originally built to be a lab assistant to Dr. Light, Mega Man is noticeably very human-like for a robot. While he is a pacifist by nature, he was willing to step up and allow himself to be upgraded into a combat robot in order to battle Dr. Wily and rescue the other robots that were stolen by him. From then on, Mega Man serves as a hero to both humans and robots, battling the forces of evil, namely Wily, in order to protect those that he cares about. Ultimately, Mega Man is still a robot, meaning that much of his personality is due to his programming. So while he is a good guy, he was designed to be one, so it's questionable how much of that is his choice. That said, even Mega Man has his limits, as seen in Mega Man 7, where he finally gets fed up with Wily's antics and attempts to murder him outright to put a stop to the cycle, only being stopped by his programming's adherence to Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. But at the end of the day, he is a hero. Next, let's talk about the young lion, Roy. Not to be confused with another Roy we'll be getting to later. Like with most Fire Emblem protagonists, Roy is a strong yet kind-hearted individual who cares about his friends and comrades. That said, he ranks lower than the others for 2 reasons. One, since he is nobility rather than royalty, his leadership skills are called into question far less than the previous 3, meaning he loses out on those bonus points. And the other, more prominent issue is that he is by far the youngest of the lot, coming in at merely 15 years old. As a result, he has a lot of the flaws of someone his age, including some slight arrogance and impatience. Still, with a role model like his father, it makes sense that he would be eager to live up to his legacy. Moving on to the shirtless scientist, Shulk. As a man of science, Shulk is much more clever and level-headed than most other characters on this list. He approaches most situations rationally and methodically, often to the point of fault. However, while he is partially motivated to fight the Mechon due to his curiosity about them, much of his drive stems from the deep-seated desire for revenge for the attack on Colony 9. This means that the otherwise reasonable Shulk often lets his emotions get the better of him and causes him to pursue violence to solve his problems. Ultimately, he does have to come to face this side of himself and sees his own flaws, then soon changes his goal to find a more peaceful end to the conflict instead. A bit of a rocky start, sure, but at least he was able to correct his mistakes. Moving on, we have the pink puffball from Popstar, Kirby. While not the most conventional hero in the history of video games, Kirby is a hero nonetheless. He has saved Dreamland more times than we can count, and does whatever he can to help his friends whenever they need it. However, due to his more simplistic mindset, he has to be coerced into action more often than not, more than happy to live peacefully napping and eating fruit. Still, whether he's asked to help or is directly provoked by the antagonist of the day, Kirby is still the first to step up and save the day whenever the situation calls for it. Moving on to the ferocious velociraptor, Yoshi. While Yoshi is the name for both the species and the character, we feel confident enough in saying that we're talking about the specific Yoshi that often shows up to aid Mario in his adventures. In which case, we can say that he is a loyal sidekick who is more than willing to help out a friend in need, quite literally carrying the weight on his back on most adventures. However, even if we assume this is just a random Yoshi, we know that Yoshis are generally a benevolent group, as seen in the Yoshi's Island series where they collectively take turns carrying baby Mario and his friends across the island to reunite him with his brother, solely out of the sheer goodness of their hearts. The ambiguity of exactly which Yoshi is used here cost him a few spots, but even the worst case scenario is still good. Onto another animal sidekick, we have Diddy Kong. Much like his buddy Donkey Kong, Diddy has many of the same accomplishments as the spot above him, being more than willing to lend a hand for his fellow Kongs whenever they need. That said, also like Donkey Kong, he only really steps up when he personally is affected, with saving the island being secondary to reclaiming whatever was taken from him, be it the Kong's banana horde, or one of their own being kidnapped. Still, he has helped save the island more than a few times, and he's not one to shy away from adventure. We have yet another group entry on our hands with the various heroes from the Dragon Quest series. All four of these characters are avatar characters suffering from silent protagonist syndrome, meaning their defining characteristics are basically that of a lump of clay. As such, there's not really much we can say about any of them. Still, as their title suggests, they are heroes, saving their respective kingdoms from whatever evil happens to be plaguing them. Coming up to the halfway point of this section, we find intergalactic bounty hunter Samus Aran. And just as a warning, anyone who says Zero Suit Samus in the comments is getting slapped. Regardless, while she has saved the galaxy multiple times, most often from the villainous space pirates, there are a few major marks against her that keeps her from scoring any higher. The first is that she is a bounty hunter, which, while not as questionable as being a mercenary, still allows for some questionable morality in her employers regardless. Thankfully for Samus though, the Galactic Federation she works for seems to be a generally fine organization, so this doesn't hurt her placement all too much. What does hurt her ranking is that she is another victim of silent protagonist syndrome, being largely silent and expressionless in most of her appearances. While this usually leaves a question mark next to their personality, this actually leads into the biggest issue with Samus, in that she is a cold and hardened warrior with no emotional connection to death. While this could simply be the product of the darker tone of the Metroid series, and there are several exceptions which show her more tender side, for the most part, her emotionless disconnect from everything around her leaves a huge stain on this otherwise heroic bounty hunter's track record. Our next spot goes to the Princess of the Mushroom Kingdom, Princess Peach. Setting aside the countless fan theories, Peach is easily one of the nicest characters on the list. She's kind and considerate to a fault to everyone in her kingdom, from her Toad subjects to the Mario brothers, and even to Bowser, clearly showing she holds no resentment for all he's put her through. Also, while she's usually passive, there are times when she's willing to step up and help save the day. whether it's as a group effort such as in New Super Mario World, or in a complete role reversal where she has to rescue a kidnapped Mario in Super Princess Peach. That said, this only serves as the exception that proves the rule, since, as the meme goes, she gets kidnapped constantly, so much so that the residents of the Mushroom Kingdom have become somewhat jaded to the fact. It's this pervasive damsel in distress role that keeps her from placing any higher in our ranking. Next is a double entry with Pyra and Mithra. Unlike with Sheik and Zelda, Pyra and Mithra are actually separate characters, each with their own thoughts, personalities, and abilities. However, since they share one body, their actions and motivations still coincide with one another, meaning we still have to look at them as one entry on this list. Mithra specifically is one of the two legendary blades, known as Aegis, and was created personally by the god of their world, the Architect. When the other Aegis, Malos, is unleashed on the world and launches an attack on Alrest, Mithra steps up to battle him in a series of events, which would later come to be called the Aegis War. While Mithra was able to defeat Malos in the end, the aftermath of the war ended up destroying several titans, the entire kingdom of Torna, and thousands of people, including several of Mithra's friends and allies. The anguish of the casualties causes a split in Mithra's personality, resulting in the birth of Pyra, and the two of them are sealed beneath the Cloud Sea until someone who can control their power comes along. When Rex arrives 500 years later to reawaken them, he accepts them despite them trying to use him for their selfish intentions, and they, in turn, start to open up more to him, and start working through their grief in other ways instead, being able to finally defeat Malos once and for all. Despite having a few dark spots in their past, they are ultimately able to overcome them, proving themselves worthy of a decent spot in our good section. From one double entry to another, next is Robin and Coron. These two end up sharing a spot for pretty much the same reason. They're both avatar characters. Since they are literally stand-ins for the player, much of their personality and actions are up to said player's discretion. However, this isn't as much of a problem for these two as it will be for some other characters further down our list. While they are avatars, they aren't silent protagonists, meaning they have some level of character on their own. Additionally, both of them are plenty heroic enough due to their actions, which they're able to do in spite of their more sinister bloodlines. Robin defeats the fell dragon Grima, in spite of being the one destined to become the host for its revival, while Coron battles the first dragon Anakos, who is later revealed to be their father. If we had a gun to our heads and were told to rank them individually, we would probably place Robin over Coron, due to the latter being a bit too naive for their own good at times. But overall, it's too close to call, thus their shared spot on our list. The next spot might seem a bit odd, but we're giving it to Joker. It feels strange placing a master thief this high on the list, but if Detective Conan has taught us anything, it's that you can't always judge a thief by his calling card. In Joker's case, the things he steals are not actual treasures, but rather metaphysical representations of people's desires, which he steals from the mind palaces of corrupt individuals. From that perspective, this makes Joker out to be more of a vigilante superhero who protects the weak and victimized by reforming adults who are abusing their positions for their own personal gain. Granted, this comes with its own set of issues, but for the most part, Joker uses his power for good, so that's enough to earn him a decent spot. Next up, we have Ike. Ike suffers from a lot of the same issues that Samus does. He's the leader of the Grail Mercenaries, a band of soldiers for hire founded by his father. As such, he's also a hardened warrior who's willing to do whatever it takes to complete the mission. The main difference is that Ike isn't nearly as heroic as Samus, since his main loyalty lies with his friends. Any heroics he performs thereof often is the result of his employers, rather than any sense of justice on his part. The only thing that saves him from being dropped any lower is the fact that we can get a better read on his personality, where we see him as a blunt yet loyal leader to his fellow mercenaries who strives to be an honorable warrior like his dad. He's also more than willing to find a peaceful solution first in spite of his profession, offering most bosses he faces the option to surrender and flee instead of killing them outright, which says a lot. Now we get to the Pokemon trainers, Red and Leaf. Pokemon protagonists are generally hard to pin down morally. Setting aside the morally gray area of training Pokemon, all of them have to deal with the unfortunate combination of being silent protagonists and player insert characters. As such, we can only judge by the actions of the characters in question. In the case of Red and Leaf, while they are far from the most heroic Pokemon protagonists, they do have a few accomplishments under their belt. They are responsible for defeating Giovanni, and therefore single-handedly taking down Team Rocket. Additionally, Red also makes appearances outside of his appearance as a playable character, though this does him no favors as he remains a silent character in all such appearances. But at the end of the day, they are heroes. Finally, we get to the blue blur himself, Sonic the Hedgehog. Second only to Mario and not needing any introduction, Sonic lands this high up for much of the same reasons. He saved the day from the villainous Dr. Eggman multiple times, and is willing to do just about anything for his friends. What keeps him from placing any higher is the fact that Sonic is much more of a free spirit, doing whatever he wants whenever the mood strikes him. This makes him to be a bit more of an unwilling hero at times, only stepping up to battle evil when he feels like it. Fortunately, he's usually up for a fight, so this rarely becomes an issue. But he still comes across as more selfish than some of the higher spots on this list. But say what you want about Sonic, he is a reliable hero and a good friend. Moving on to another hunter, Richter Belmont. Both as a fighter and as a character, Richter is basically a clone of his ancestor Simon. Being a member of the Belmont clan, his character development starts and ends with his desire to battle and defeat the evil Dracula. There are a few details to the story which add some development to Richter, though not nearly enough to differentiate him from Simon. So what causes him to fall a whopping 22 slots below his ancestor? Well, that would be one action in particular. Upon hearing the prophecy of Nostradamus about the end of the world in 1999 by Dracula, Richter bequeaths the vampire killer to the Morris clan for safekeeping until the Belmonts come to reclaim it. However, the vampire killer also came with a curse, in that it would drain the life force away from anyone not directly related to the Belmont clan, something which Richter should have known about due to his bloodline. This makes Richter indirectly responsible for the events of all games taking place after Symphony of the Night. Because of this, we had to rank him lower, but his direct actions were still heroic. Moving on to Princess Daisy. Compared to her pink counterpart, Daisy doesn't have nearly as many kidnappings under her belt, which saves her from the issues that plagued Peach's ranking. That said, we still had to place her lower due to the sheer lack of appearances she's had in the main series Mario games, leaving little to work with in determining her character. From her appearances in the various spin-off games, she's been shown to be a very kind and outgoing character, which is enough to earn her a spot in this section. Now we get to the bear and bird duo, Banjo and Kazooie. While these two do have their own flaws and character traits, they almost exclusively operate as one unit, and their personal quirks tend to balance each other out, so we're going to rank them together. Collectively, they share a lot of the same flaws as the Kongs, which does make sense, seeing as how they come from the same parent company. They're often unwilling heroes, typically not stepping up unless they're personally affected. However, since Gruntilda has such a blood vendetta against them, that is typically the case anyway. That being said, this also brings to light the limited scope of their heroics, as they're pretty much restricted to the Isle of Hags and the small number of individuals who call that place their home. Because of this, we had to place them lower, but at the end of the day, Banjo and Kazooie are still both heroes. Now let's talk about Ness. Unlike Lucas, Ness is much harder to get a feel for personality-wise, mainly because he doesn't have one. He's yet another character suffering from silent protagonist syndrome, meaning his personality, motives, and character development are mostly up to the player's imagination. He does have a lot of heroic deeds to his name, but not knowing his motivations, they end up not being as impactful as they would otherwise. Plus, with as prone as he is to homesickness, Ness comes off as a bit more selfish than most heroes. Though he is still just a child, so we can't really fault him for much. Moving on to Elf. While we won't be covering the Pikmin themselves since they're treated more as tools rather than characters, the characters using them are another story. In Elf's case, he was sent to the Pikmin planet in order to collect fruit to end a global food shortage on his home planet. During his adventure, he's able to rescue his fellow explorers, Brittany and Charlie, as well as Captain Olimar from the first two games. This, along with the noble cause for his mission, lands him into the good tier. But as is the norm for this end of the section, there are plenty of other characters that are more heroic. Next is the man in green himself, Luigi. While not as heroic as his more famous brother, Luigi has more than enough good points to earn himself a spot in the good. What hurts his ranking is the fact that he is cowardly, and will often try to weasel his way out of having to put himself into danger. This makes him much more of an unwilling hero than Mario. and as a result, his list of heroic deeds are essentially slashed in half by comparison. Still, in the grand scheme of things, Luigi is very much a hero in his own right, and he's willing to step up and help his friends when the need arises, so we can cut him a bit of slack. Next up, we have one of the oldest characters on the list, Pac-Man. As a character, Pac-Man is about as simple as his design. His initial characterization was virtually non-existent, and his personality and relationships have been subject to change depending on the situation. The only things that have been consistent across all appearances is that he is a family man who cares deeply about his loved ones, as well as his huge appetite, though that has no real bearing on his morality. As little as this is to work with, it's just enough to earn Pac-Man a spot in the good tier. Next is fan favorite Isabelle. While not nearly as heroic as most characters in this section, Isabelle makes her way into the section through sheer force of positivity. She's a hard worker and is always eager to do her best, despite being a bit too scatterbrained at times. She's kind to the villagers and works to make the town as nice as possible through the various civic duties she's tasked to deal with. For all that positivity, kindness, and go-getter attitude, it certainly wouldn't be wrong to say that she is a Belle. Pun intended. Moving on to another mercenary, Falco Lombardi. If Fox is a furry Luke Skywalker, then Falco would be a feathered Han Solo. He's cocky and often uncooperative, constantly chastising his crewmates for their mistakes, especially Fox. He frequently leaves and rejoins Star Fox at multiple times throughout the series, and is even suggested to be a former gang member prior to joining the team. However, he does have a strong sense of loyalty to his friends, and will always come to their rescue in their time of need, if only he can take the credit for coming to their aid. As a mercenary's mercenary, there's a lot to consider here, but if you can earn his trust, you can be sure to count on him when you need him. Now let's talk about the masked swordsman, Meta Knight. To get the negative out of the way first, Meta Knight does have a handful of appearances as a villain, terrorizing the denizens of Dreamland in order to test his own power. However, these instances are far and few between, and based on his other appearances, are clearly the exception to his characterization. More often than not, Meta Knight functions as both a mentor and a rival to Kirby, helping the pink Puffball to maintain the peace in Popstar, and defending its residents from evil. Because of this, we have to place Meta Knight in the good section, but those black marks on his record certainly weigh him down a good bit. Speaking of black marks, our next spot goes to Dark Pit. As a product of the Mirror of Truth, Dark Pit was created to be the polar opposite of Pit in order to work for the Underworld Army. However, since Pit's defining characteristic was his loyalty rather than his morality, Dark Pit holds allegiances to no one while also maintaining a strong enough moral compass to stand against the Underworld instead. He did hold a strong resentment towards his lighter half at first, fighting against him out of principle for being too similar to him. However, this was also short-lived, as the 3 years Pit spent trapped in a ring showed Dark Pit that he can't exist without him. Since then, their relationship has gone from one abject animosity to mutual respect, and they tend to act more as friendly rivals and allies of circumstance. Unfortunately, his initial hostility keeps him from ranking any higher, but Dark Pit isn't nearly as dark as his name implies. Next, one could say is the embodiment of overcompensation, Cloud Strife. Another mercenary, Cloud ends up mirroring a lot of the same character flaws as Ike, being a hardened and callous warrior whose heroic deeds are generally the byproduct of his employer's intentions. The difference here is that Cloud is a loner, meaning that he has less of an incentive to step up when others are in danger, and as such doesn't have nearly as heroic of a resume as Ike does. Plus, there's the whole going insane following the death of his friend thing dragging him down as well. The only thing keeping him from dropping any further is his relationship with Tifa, who is among the few other characters Cloud actually cares for, and the only one who can motivate him to fight for her. Still, compared to the rest of this section, Cloud just doesn't come close to them in terms of goodness. Our second to last, least good character in the good section goes to Bayonetta. Let's not kid ourselves, objectively speaking, Bayonetta is a villain. She's a dark witch who sold her soul to a demon in exchange for power, which she uses to kill angels and gods. That being said, we do have to look at her contextually, and that's where things get a bit more interesting. For one thing, the angels she kills are, well, no angels, that's for sure. They're cruel, megalomaniacal, and care little for anything other than themselves. From that perspective, Bayonetta becomes the lesser of two evils, making her the good side pretty much by default. And that's also not taking into consideration the fact that Bayonetta herself is a lot kinder than she lets on. While she can be sarcastic and snarky for the most part, she is very loyal to those she cares about, putting herself into danger to rescue them whenever they're in trouble. She also has a soft spot for children, as seen when dealing with characters such as her younger self, Cereza. Though that's still not enough to completely ignore the whole demon summoning thing, especially when she can barely control them in the first place. But she does eke by just barely into our good section. And finally, rounding out our good characters, we have King Dedede. In some respects, we were both too harsh and not harsh enough when ranking King Dedede in our previous list. He is selfish, greedy, abusive, and cares very little for those around him. He forces his way into a position of power and abuses his position to get whatever he wants. That said, after all he's done in order to save Popstar and protect its inhabitants, calling Dedede anything less than a hero would just be inaccurate. For every appearance he's had as a villain, he's had another where he's been an ally, doing everything in his power to protect his subjects from a greater evil. He's even willing to team up with his mortal enemy, Kirby, if it means protecting those he cares about. He may be mean and egotistical, but that doesn't stop King Dedede from taking care of his subjects in the end. We're now officially more than halfway through the list, so it's finally time to descend into neutral territory. These characters fall in the gray area. Starting off this section, we have the Queen of the Stars, Rosalina. If you thought Peach not doing anything while being kidnapped was annoying, Rosalina has far less of an excuse. She is easily one of the oldest and most powerful forces in the Mario universe, keeping watch over the galaxies over the course of thousands of years. Despite this, her involvement in the story thus far has been minimalistic, to say the least. This would be fine if she was supposed to keep from interfering with others, as sort of an impartial observer. However, she even does this when she herself is affected, and her Lumas are in the process of dying without the power of the Comet Observatory. She could just as easily solve her problems on her own, yet she chooses to let Mario do the work for her, and for that reason, we just couldn't place her in the good category. Next up is Dr. Mario. While you could make the argument that this is just Mario in a white coat and should be placed with him, the game lists them as separate characters, so we are going to judge him separately. And as Dr. Mario exclusively, he doesn't really do anything. Sure, he battles viruses in order to protect the Mushroom Kingdom from disease as a medical doctor. That's just a function of his position rather than a desire to protect others. It is something at least, so we'll place him on the upper end of this section. It's a similar case for our next entry, Wii Fit Trainers. If a doctor can't make it into the good category, then a personal trainer has no chance. In the case of the Wii Fit Trainers, it doesn't really help that that's the entirety of the character. They have no backstory, no character development, no personality. They don't do anything significant, nor do they have any interpersonal relationships that would affect their character in any way. They're just fitness coaches. At the very least, their profession puts them in the same general area as Dr. Mario, so the Wii Fit Trainers can enjoy a spot in the upper neutral area. And speaking of blank characters, we also have to talk about the Ice Climbers. As a product of the early NES era, the characterization of the Ice Climbers is virtually non-existent. They climb snowy mountains, and that's about it. Even the relationship between Popo and Nana themselves doesn't help, since the ambiguity of the relationship leaves a lot more questions than answers. Since we don't have much to go off of, we have to lump these two together with the other do-nothing characters. And in case you couldn't tell, this is going to be the theme for the next several entries. Following that trend, we have the Inklings. If this was a specific character, such as Agent 3 perhaps, we would actually have something to talk about, but that's not the case. Since the narrative establishes the male and female Inklings as separate characters, this means that they are just generic Inklings not tied to any specific character. As such, we can only judge by traits consistent across Inklings as a species. And considering how little that leaves us, the philosophical discussions necessary to come to a consensus on that front is a little above our pay grade. Next is the Soldier of Stealth, Solid Snake. Unlike the previous entries, Snake does have quite a few actions that would normally affect his ranking. However, we still have to discount them anyway for two reasons. One, the heroic actions he makes are offset by the morally questionable nature of war, made even more complicated by the ethics surrounding Snake's origins to begin with. The other, more compelling reason that keeps him in this section is the fact that Snake is a soldier, meaning that his actions are not entirely his own, but rather merely him following orders. This places the morality of his actions on his superiors instead, while Snake himself is left with precious little to judge his own morality. especially with him basically being born to be a soldier and nothing else. Returning to our regularly scheduled program, we have Captain Olimar. Whereas his alt had a noble reason for visiting the Pikmin planet, Olimar doesn't even have that. His first exploration was due to him crash landing on the planet and just trying to survive, while his subsequent visits have been for the sake of hunting for treasures to get his company out of debt. This not only blanks him for any noble intentions, but much like Snake, it also shifts the morality of his actions from Pikmin 2 onward onto Hakatate Freight rather than Olimar himself. And rounding out our blank characters, we have the Villager. Like the last few characters, the Villager doesn't really do anything significant to affect their ranking, even in the best of circumstances. However, that last sentence also brings to light the reason why Villager ranks at the bottom of this subsection. Because the Villager is an avatar on top of being a mostly silent protagonist, most of their actions, personality, and character are determined by the player, and subject to change. However, this ends up being more to the Villager's benefit, since the low-stakes nature of the Animal Crossing series has really no impact on morality, meaning that the range of possible characterizations are much more narrow than most Avatar characters. Now that we have that out of the way, let's get started with the rest of this section with the Duck Hunt duo. We say duo, but it's more of a trio, as the off-screen hunter also counts as a part of the sentry as well. In fact, it's this unseen entity that is the only one to affect the ranking of this group. The duck is just a duck, and the dog is acting on the hunter's behalf. The hunter, on the other hand, is an actual hunter, and the debate on the morality of hunting for sport is one that will likely go on in perpetuity. But because of the hunter's unseen presence, we don't really have any intel on why he hunts, which leaves the morality of his actions pretty much entirely unanswered. Now, onto a large group, let's knock out most of our Pokemon characters in one entry. In National Pokédex order, they are Ivysaur, Squirtle, Pikachu, Jigglypuff, Pichu, Lucario, and Greninja. These 7 Pokemon end up ranked together for one reason alone. They're basically just wild animals. Wild Pokemon, for the most part, don't do anything particularly noteworthy in terms of morality, and caught Pokemon are subject to the morality and actions of their respective trainers. Ivysaur and Squirtle could be argued for as part of Red Leaf's team, being more on the good side. And that would be a convincing argument if we could confirm whether or not any of them were a part of their team during their adventure, or if they came afterwards. Since we can't, we have to play it safe and rank them with the others. We did, however, consider placing Lucario above the others due to its Pokédex entries mentioning how it has a strong natural sense of justice. However, we had to knock it down a couple points due to the existence of Mega Lucario, a form which turns Lucario into a heartless and merciless fighting machine and capable of thinking of anything other than the destruction of its enemies. While this is only a temporary form it takes in extreme circumstances, we figure it's enough to cancel out its good points and put it on par with the rest of these Pokemon. Let's get another group out of the way as well. The one made up of Terry Bogard, Min Min, Little Mac, and Ken Masters. Ranked in that order. Fighting games don't allow for a lot of complex characterizations in their structures, hence why we have to look outside of Smash Bros. To make this list in the first place. As a result, they are very reliant on backstories to determine their characters' moralities. The thing is, as far as these 4 are concerned, none of them have anything in particular that would justify a higher or lower ranking beyond them being fighters. They each have their own reasons for fighting, but none of them are particularly noble or wicked, and differentiating one from another comes down to splitting hairs. For the true neutral on our list, we have the Mii fighters. Miis are the very definition of a player insert character, and also an avatar. In fact, they are nothing more than a customizable avatar that the player can use to put themselves into a game. As such, everything about the Miis, from their actions to their morality, is entirely up to how said player chooses to interpret them. That said, there are a few ways that they can have some agency separate from their creator's intentions. Namely, if a Mii is used to represent a character who otherwise wouldn't be in Smash in the first place, such as Sans or Cuphead. However, these are also up to the player's choices to add them in the first place, to say nothing of the fact that they're just costumes to begin with, so we won't be counting those. In a very similar position, we find Steve and Alex. While it may be revolutionary, Minecraft isn't exactly known for its riveting story. With so much to do and so little direction on what to do, there isn't really anything that could approximate a canon storyline of events in the Minecraft universe. You could go off and defeat the Ender Dragon in order to save the End Dimension, or you could just make a farm and raise some cows. Of course, even that doesn't help with Steve and Alex's ranking, as without any storyline, there's nothing to give us a reason for defeating the Ender Dragon in the first place. For all we know, the dragon was just minding its own business in the End Dimension until Steve and Alex showed up. So your guess is as good as mine. The next spot goes to Game Freak's favorite Pokemon, Charizard. For the most part, Charizard falls under the same umbrella as the other Pokemon characters, not doing anything of consequence as a wild Pokemon and being subject to its trainer's wishes as an owned one. However, like Lucario, Charizard suffers in its ranking due to the existence of its Mega form. While we don't have the specific details on Mega Charizard X's behavior due to Charizard's exclusion from the Alolan Pokédex, we can't imagine it would be too flattering for the Flame Pokemon. The difference here is that Lucario was able to offset its handicap with its naturally heroic demeanor, while Charizard has no such luxury. Next, we finally come to our last Fire Emblem character, Byleth. Like Robin and Coron, Byleth is an avatar character, but unlike them, they're a silent protagonist, leaning even further into the pitfalls of a player insert character. What's worse is that while Robin and Coron were able to coast on the heroic nature of their actions, that can't be said for Byleth. As a mercenary turned teacher, their actions are dictated by which of three characters, Dimitri, Claude, or Edelgard, that they choose to ally themselves with. The problem here is that each of these three are so inherently flawed that the best outcome Byleth can hope for is a Pyrrhic victory where only they and their selected allies manage to survive. On top of that, there's the matter of one of the three, Edelgard, being the closest thing to an overarching antagonist that Three Houses has, meaning that allying with her puts Byleth on a darker path by default. It wouldn't be fair to classify Byleth as a bad person, even in the Crimson Flower route, but all this ambiguity solidifies the placement in the gray area. It's time to show our moves with our next entry, Captain Falcon. Pretty much everything we said earlier about fighting game characters has to go double for racing game characters, especially characters like Captain Falcon, who are rarely ever seen in their own games outside of the character's select screen. With little to no heroic actions in-game, we're forced to look at characters' backstories to get a better grasp on his personality, something made all the more difficult due to the amount of vague, non-canon, or even conflicting information provided from outside sources. We know that he is a bounty hunter, something which we have already discussed as being a moral gray area by default, and that he's a recluse due to the massive number of enemies he's made across the galaxy. Other than that, there's really not much we can confirm to affect his ranking. Onto another fighting game character, Ryu. Unlike the bulk of our fighting characters, Ryu has a prominent role in the Street Fighter story, which does affect his ranking in this list. Unfortunately, as you may have surmised from him ranking below the others, it's not a good look for him. This is due almost exclusively to him opening himself up to the Satsu no Hado, a force that grants the user immense power at the cost of slowly erasing their humanity. This would have eventually turned Ryu into a villain over the course of several years, especially as several others sought to harness the power for their own gain. While Ryu himself is forced to rely on his power in order to survive, he's eventually able to purge it from his body, which prevents him from sinking any further down our list. Next, we have what is technically the oldest character on this list, Mr. Game & Watch. We say technically here because the character Mr. Game & Watch doesn't actually exist outside of the Super Smash Bros. Universe, aside from a handful of cameo appearances here and there. Instead, he is more of an amalgamation of the entire Game & Watch universe, possessing the traits and characteristics of every character thereof. Due to the simplicity of the Game & Watch games, most of them do not contribute to the morality of Mr. Game & Watch as a whole. However, there are two major exceptions, each in a different direction. The first is the Rescue Squad from Fire, which uses a trampoline to rescue people from a burning building. While this is just a function of their job, much like the rest of the characters, it is technically a heroic act that gives them a point to the good side. Unfortunately, that's undone and then some by the other entity, the titular octopus from the game of the same name. This is the closest thing in the entire Game & Watch universe to an actual antagonist, making its inclusion into Mr. Game & Watch a huge hit to his morality. Ultimately, however, both of these are a small percentage of the entities that make up Mr. Game & Watch, so while the octopus keeps him on the lower end, he still ends up solidly in the gray area. Finishing up our gray area, we have Rob. It's hard to get a reading on Rob's personality since he is just a toy. And that's not a euphemism for anything either. We're talking about an actual physical toy that you could buy in the real world during the mid-1980s. His only appearance as a character to date is in Brawl's Subspace Emissary story, initially under the guise of the Ancient Minister. Here, Rob is forced to sacrifice his own kind in order to plunge the world of trophies into subspace. This would make him to be a villain, however the third act of the story sees Rob shed his Ancient Minister disguise and turn against the subspace army due to the mistreatment and sacrifice of his fellow robots, finally becoming too much for him to bear. This turn of events saves Rob from falling into the bad tier, though his initial villainous appearance, plus his overall neutrality outside of the Smash Bros. Universe, places him solidly at the bottom of our neutral section. Finally, we have reached the bad and the evil section. These characters are the cruelest and most malicious villains in all of Smash Bros. Many universes. Our least bad fighter in this section has to be Incineroar. Incineroar earns a spot in this section solely for being a Dark-type Pokemon. Some of you may have heard the rumor about how the Dark type is known as the Evil type in Japanese. And while that is oversimplifying things considerably, it's not entirely inaccurate. You may also be wondering why fellow Dark-type Greninja isn't sharing this spot with Incineroar. However, that would be because Greninja doesn't really act like a Dark Pokemon. None of its Pokédex entries mention anything about temperament, and every appearance it's had depicts it as an honorable ninja-type character, implying its typing to be representative of literal darkness, rather than what the Dark type is supposed to be. Incineroar, on the other hand, is a Dark Pokemon through and through, being especially violent, selfish, and not afraid to fight dirty. It does have a kinder side towards small Pokemon, and for the most part, it shares the same traits as the other Pokemon fighters as well. So we do have to keep Incineroar at the top of this section. However, for being so much more aggressive than the others, it still lands in the bad tier regardless. Our next spot goes to the grossest member of the list, Wario. While initially appearing as an evil counterpart to Mario, Wario has since transitioned to being much more of an anti-hero than an antagonist. That said, while other anti-heroes such as Dark Pit and King Dedede were able to climb into the good section, Wario still lands in the bad tier due to him retaining his antagonistic traits even when he is the hero. He's selfish, greedy, lazy, and never does anything for anyone else unless there's something in it for himself. He has done some heroic things, but again, only by happenstance as he searches for treasure. He's not as bad as some of the other villains on our list, but as long as money is in the picture, Wario still manages to hold on to the Bad Mario moniker to this day. Next, we have another anti-hero, Wolf O'Donnell. Remember how we were harping on about how mercenaries and bounty hunters were a moral gray area in and of themselves? Well, that mostly comes down to Wolf showing us exactly what happens when they go wrong. He is a vicious criminal who will accept any job regardless of legality, and is more than willing to betray anyone for the right price. He is the eternal rival to Fox and will often ally himself with other villains solely for the chance to battle against him. Despite this, however, Wolf is not completely irredeemable. He has shown to be capable of reform, wanting to save the Lilat system in order to remove the bounties on his and his team's heads. Also, while he despises Fox, he does respect him and is willing to team up with him, if only so he can defeat him himself later. Overall, Wolf's negative aspects far outweigh his good ones, but the existence of his good traits keeps him on the upper end of this section. We have another group entry here with the mob characters, Piranha Plant, Zombie, and Enderman. There's not a whole lot we can say about the morality of a mob enemy. For the most part, they're mindless obstacles that must be defeated or avoided with little in terms of autonomy to their own names. Therefore, the only metric we can judge their morality is by how much of a threat they are to their respective adversaries. By that metric, Piranha Plant would have to be the best of the three, due to its limited mobility and lack of durability, while the Enderman would be the worst due to its advanced tactics, stronger abilities, and greater longevity. Other than that, we can't say much other than this is the cutoff point between the anti-heroes and the true villains. Kicking off this cutoff point, we have our final group entry, the Koopalings. These 7 brats, consisting of Larry, Morton, Wendy, Iggy, Roy, Lemmy, and Ludwig, are some of the more competent members of Bowser's army. They are often tasked with kidnapping Princess Peach and maintaining key strongholds. This puts them above the basic mobs by virtue of actually doing something of consequence. However, this still leaves them as just being minions regardless. Not far behind, we have the 8th Koopaling, Bowser Jr. While their roles may be similar, Jr. stands above his whatever they are to him by taking on a more proactive role in Bowser's army. He operates on his own independently of his father, antagonizing Mario and his friends solely for the sake of fighting against them. That said, while he may have more autonomy than the previous 2 entries, Jr. is still merely working for his father. He may be a bit more than a minion, but Bowser Jr. falls short of being a full-fledged villain of his own, earning him a spot near the middle of this section. Our next spot goes to the last Pokemon on our list, Mewtwo. Okay, so we're gonna throw out the whole wild animal defense on this one mainly because it doesn't even apply to Mewtwo. It's a genetically enhanced clone of Mew, created to be the ultimate fighting machine. And they succeeded. Multiple Pokédex entries mention how Mewtwo has the most savage heart among all Pokémon, and that it only thinks of how to destroy its foes. There have been a few exceptions to this rule, mostly in the Pokemon anime, but without a specific Mewtwo for us to base this on, we can only go based on the Pokédex. Additionally, we also have Mega Mewtwo Y to consider, in case you've been keeping track. Much like Charizard, we don't have the specific details, but given how cruel and heartless Mewtwo is without Mega Evolution, that's probably for the best. The only thing saving it from dropping any lower is the fact that it isn't inherently evil per se, but the fact that Mewtwo is as vicious and destructive as it is. This makes it all the more dangerous, earning it a low spot. For the first of our truly evil characters, we have the king of the Kremlin crew, King K. Rool. This reptile is the archenemy of Donkey Kong, constantly stealing the latter's banana horde for various reasons while trying to take over DK Island for himself. He is a constant threat to the Kongs, as well as his own minions, as he frequently mistreats his own Kremlings for their failures. What keeps K. Rool from dropping any lower is the limited scope of his villainy, as he is focused solely on antagonizing the Kongs without any grander ambitions. Still, no one can deny that King K. Rool is a villain through and through, so he more than earns his spot here. Not too far behind is the original evil lizard, Bowser. To be honest, either one of these two could have ended up here. After all, Bowser does have a few good points to his credit. He does seem to care about his minions, and he is willing to work with Mario if the situation calls for it. However, we're giving the edge to Bowser since he has the potential to be much more of a threat than K. Rool. He's not afraid to turn his wrath outside of the Mushroom Kingdom, or even outside the solar system if it helps him further his evil goals. This makes Bowser to be a bit more of a global threat, which just barely edges out King K. Rool. That said, he isn't completely evil either, meaning Bowser lands just outside our bottom 5. Entering our bottom 5, our next spot goes to Kazuya Mishima. While Kazuya tends to alternate between villain and anti-hero, we feel confident in saying that he is evil to the core. He takes over the Mishima Zaibatsu by throwing his father into a ravine and uses the company's power to make a bid to take over the world. He constantly fights against his son, father, and grandfather for control over the company, using his half-demon powers in order to try to kill them once and for all. Granted, the rest of the Mishima family are evil enough in their own right, each trying to implement their own plans for world domination. However, even when trying to stop them, Kazuya stands out as among the most evil, as his sole motivation is that he cannot stand the idea of a world ruled by anyone other than himself and himself alone. The only reason why he doesn't rank any lower is because these next few villains are just that much more dangerous, and this guy will at least make sure not to destroy everything in his path. It's a toss-up between the next few, but we're giving the next spot to Dark Samus. As the Metroid Prime, a being of pure Phazon energy, Dark Samus came into being by merging with Samus's DNA in her Phazon suit. At first, she was more of a force of nature rather than a character, as she was driven solely by her desire to absorb more Phazon energy. However, by Metroid Prime 3, she had developed enough sapience to become a legitimate threat to the galaxy. She assumes control over the sentient planet Phase in order to control the spread of Phazon and conquer the galaxy by assimilating any and all planets she comes across. What keeps her out of our bottom 3 is the fact that this development comes so late in her character development, being essentially a mindless zombie for the bulk of her existence. Still, for the level of danger Dark Samus poses to the galaxy, we would be insane not to rank her in our bottom 5. We're giving the bronze medal of evil to Samus's other enemy, Ridley. While his ambitions never go quite as far as total galactic destruction, Ridley ranks below Dark Samus due to his sheer tenacity and the specific cruelty of his actions. He is the leader of the space pirates, being among the most consistent and prevalent threats to the galaxy. Ridley, in particular, is among the strongest and most cruel members, being the one to kill Samus's parents and fighting against her multiple times. Despite being killed several times, he continues to be a thorn in her side, constantly being revived and reborn by the space pirates in order to fulfill their goal of galactic conquest. For that level of determination, along with the heartlessness of his crimes, Ridley easily earns the Bronze Medal of Evil. Our Silver Medal of Evil has to go to the one-winged angel of death, Sephiroth. Born from a series of experiments known as the Genova Project, Sephiroth was originally a hero of Shinra, taking part with the rest of Soldier in the war with the nation of Wutai. However, upon learning the truth of his origin, Sephiroth went rogue, destroying everything in his path as he tried to get closer to Genova. He then uses Genova's body, along with the Black Materia's meteor, in order to try to merge with the planet's lifestream, believing it's his destiny to become the god of his world. He's also responsible for creating the Geostigma virus, a disease which infects those who come into contact with the tainted lifestream, in order to ultimately revive Genova. What cements Sephiroth's position this high up is that not only are his ambitions far higher than any other villain discussed thus far, but he also has the power to accomplish them. As long as Genova cells exist, he too will continue to exist and revive himself, having both the strength and the willpower to prevent the lifestream from claiming him. For that reason, Sephiroth easily earns the title of the most dangerous villain on our list, if not our most evil one. Finally, our Gold Medal of Evil has to go to the King of Evil, Ganondorf. We're giving Ganondorf the gold medal here for one simple reason. He is, literally, evil incarnate. As the manifestation of Demise's curse upon Link's bloodline, Ganondorf exists solely to spread hatred and destruction across the land of Hyrule. His very presence creates monsters fueled by malice to terrorize the population while he attempts to take over the world for himself. Other villains may have had grander ambitions, greater powers, or more heinous actions. But for being the literal incarnation of pure, unadulterated evil, we felt that we had to give Ganondorf the title of most evil fighter in all of Smash Bros. Whew, that was a long list. But with our morality spectrum completed, let's wrap things up by handing out some Sinner medals. The Darwin medal has to go to the Mob Squad, Piranha Plant, Zombie, and Enderman. They are little more than obstacles to get over, and therefore an easy pick. We're gonna give the Lust medal to Bayonetta. Everything from her flirtatious nature, to her skin-tight leather outfit that gets all the more revealing when using her powers, is a testament to her game's M rating. The Envy medal goes to Dark Pit. His jealousy of Pit was so great, it was enough to make him an antagonist for the entire first half of his game, and almost cost him a spot in the good tier. The Wrath medal is an easy one. Ganondorf is the manifestation of Demise's hatred, making him a literal embodiment of rage. Surprisingly, we're giving the Gluttony medal to King Dedede. While Kirby is more famous for his gluttony, King Dedede matches his rival point for point, while also having the selfishness to back it up. We have to give the Sloth medal to Princess Peach, for all the times she gets herself kidnapped and doesn't really do anything about it. The Pride medal goes to Kazuya. His desire for a world revolving around himself, and his inability to tolerate a world that does not, makes him a solid candidate for this one. And finally, we'll be giving the Greed medal to Wario. While he is tolerable on his own, the moment that money comes into the equation, he's willing to do anything to get his hands on it. And that's our list, but let us know in the comment section what you think. This was a long video and a lot of characters, so make sure to let us know who you think the most good and the most evil characters are in Smash Bros. And if you need a one-up, make sure to hit that notification bell and binge our Good to Evil playlist, where we break down the morality of the characters in your favorite games. But most importantly, stay wicked.